She used to believe that love meant safety and that marriage meant partnership, and when she married Daniel, she truly thought she had found both, because he spoke softly, smiled politely, opened doors, paid for dinners, and told everyone how lucky he was to have a woman like her. And in the beginning she felt chosen, seen, protected, as if life had finally settled into something solid and dependable, yet slowly, without a single dramatic moment, without shouting or violence or visible cruelty, the shape of her life began to change, and she did not even notice it happening, because control rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, disguised as concern, responsibility, and care. Daniel insisted early on that he was simply better with numbers, that finances stressed her out, and that as a husband it was his duty to manage money, so she could relax and focus on building a home, and trusting him felt natural at first, because she loved him and because he spoke with such certainty, and because society had taught her that a man providing and leading was something to be grateful for. So she agreed, handed over her paycheck, smiled when he said, "We are a team now," and did not realize that teams share power, while this arrangement slowly erased hers, and at first it seemed harmless. He would give her a card, tell her to let him know before making big purchases, joke about budgeting, like it was a game, and praise her for being low maintenance and reasonable. But over time the rules tightened, the card stopped working without explanation, the jokes turned into lectures, and the praise became conditional based on how little she needed, and how grateful she appeared. And every time she questioned it, he reminded her that he was doing this for their future, that she was lucky to have someone responsible, because many women end up with men who waste money and leave them struggling, and she would nod, swallow her discomfort, and tell herself that discomfort was just adjustment, that marriage meant compromise, and that love sometimes required trust, even when it felt uneasy. As months passed, she found herself asking for money, like a child asking permission. She would explain purchases, justify groceries, defend the cost of shoes, and every request chipped away at her dignity, though she could not yet name it as abuse, because abuse was supposed to look like bruises, yelling, broken furniture, not spreadsheets and sighs and disappointed looks. And Daniel never yelled, he never hit, he never even raised his voice. Instead, he mastered the art of disappointment, the heavy pause before responding, the look that made her feel foolish for even asking, the long explanations about responsibility and sacrifice, and how hard he worked, while she enjoyed the comfort of a home. And she started to internalize his words, believing that maybe she really was bad with money, maybe she really did need supervision, maybe independence was overrated and selfish and dangerous. And the more she doubted herself, the more confident he became, the power imbalance widening silently, until it felt normal, until she forgot what it had felt like to buy something without fear, or to open her banking app without shame, or to imagine a future where she had control over her own life. And yet to the outside world, Daniel was a dream husband. Co-workers admired him, friends praised his dedication, family members told her how lucky she was, and every compliment felt like another wall closing in, because how could she explain her misery when everything looked perfect, when there were no marks, no scenes, no evidence, only a constant ache in her chest, and a growing sense that she was shrinking inside her own life. She tried once to talk to him about wanting more independence, maybe a shared account, maybe access to the budget, and he listened patiently, nodded thoughtfully, and then explained calmly why that would not work, how emotional spending could ruin them, how trust meant letting him lead, how she should focus on gratitude instead of suspicion. And by the end of the conversation she was apologizing for upsetting him, reassuring him that she trusted him completely, even though something inside her screamed that trust should not feel like this. As time went on, he began to use her dependence against her in subtle, cutting ways. When arguments arose about anything unrelated, chores, family plans, her feelings, he would remind her that he paid the bills, that stress was on his shoulders, that she had no idea how hard it was to carry responsibility, and she would fall silent, because how could she argue when she had no financial ground to stand on, when leaving felt impossible, because she had no savings, no account, no safety net. And the isolation deepened as friends drifted away, not because he forbade her from seeing them outright, but because every outing required money, and every request came with a price of guilt and justification. And slowly she stopped asking, stopped going, stopped reaching out, and told herself that marriage naturally narrowed your world, that this was adulthood, not loneliness. Yet in the quiet moments alone, she felt the weight of what she had lost, her confidence, her autonomy, her sense of self. And sometimes late at night she would lie awake wondering when she had stopped being a person and become a dependent, wondering why she felt so small in a relationship that was supposed to make her stronger. And she tried to remember the woman she had been before, independent, capable, proud, the woman who paid her own bills, made her own choices, and believed she was enough, and that memory felt like a distant dream, like someone else entirely. And the scariest part was not the control itself, but how easily she had accepted it, how smoothly it had woven itself into her life, until questioning it felt wrong, until asking for more felt selfish, until wanting freedom felt like betrayal. And Daniel noticed her quietness, her withdrawal, and instead of concern, he responded with criticism, calling her unmotivated, lazy, ungrateful. He would say things like, "You do nothing all day," or "You have it so easy compared to me." And every word landed hard, because she had begun to believe him. She had begun to see herself through his eyes, as weak, incapable, undeserving. And when she tried once to suggest returning to work full-time, he dismissed it immediately, saying it was unnecessary, that it would disrupt their routine, that her place was at home supporting him. And the way he said it made it sound logical, caring, even loving. And yet her heart sank, because she knew that work meant independence, and independence meant losing control over her. And that was something he could not allow. And still she stayed, because leaving felt impossible, because fear wrapped around her like a cage, because she did not know how to explain to anyone why she was unhappy, because the world would ask, "What did he do?" and she would have no answer that sounded serious enough. And so she endured days blending into each other, marked by quiet resentment, small humiliations, and a growing sense of entrapment. And the breaking point did not come with a dramatic explosion. It came with a moment so small it almost seemed insignificant, when she stood in a grocery store holding her phone, staring at a declined transaction for a basic necessity, and felt a wave of shame so intense it stole her breath. And in that moment she realized that love should never make you feel like a burden, that marriage should not feel like a prison, and that control wrapped in kindness was still control. And the realization terrified her, because it meant acknowledging the truth that she had been abused without being hit, that she had been diminished without being screamed at, and that the man everyone admired had systematically taken away her power, and then blamed her for being powerless. And as she stood there, she felt something shift, not yet strength, not yet courage, but awareness. And awareness was dangerous, because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. And though she did not leave that day, though fear still ruled her choices, something had cracked open inside her, a quiet defiance, a question she could no longer silence. Is this really all I am worth? And for the first time in a long time, the answer did not come from Daniel. It came from somewhere deeper, softer, and stronger, telling her that weakness was not what he had made her, but what he needed her to believe she was, so he could stay in control. And that thought lingered long after, as she walked home, carrying groceries and the weight of a truth that would change everything, even if the path forward was still unclear, even if freedom still felt distant, because the first step toward reclaiming her life had already begun, the moment she recognized that what he called care was actually control, and what he called leadership was actually domination. And that realization would not leave her even when she tried to ignore it, because once you understand that your dependence was engineered, not accidental, you begin to question everything, and that questioning would slowly grow into resolve, even if it took time, even if it took pain, even if it took rebuilding from nothing, because sometimes survival begins not with escape, but with seeing the cage for what it truly is. When she began to see the cage, she also began to see how carefully it had been built, brick by brick, decision by decision, all disguised as love and responsibility. And once that awareness settled into her mind, it refused to leave, even when she tried to push it away. Even when she told herself she was overreacting. Even when Daniel smiled and acted generous in front of others, because now every small interaction carried a second meaning. Every comment about money, every reminder of how much he worked, every subtle joke about her not understanding finances echoed differently inside her. And she started noticing patterns she had once ignored, like how he never explained the budget in detail, only summaries that kept her dependent, how he discouraged her from learning by saying it would only stress her, how he framed control as protection and obedience as trust. And the more she noticed, the more exhausted she became, because awareness without power is its own kind of suffering. And she still lacked power, she still lacked money options and support. And yet something had shifted, because she stopped fully believing his narrative, and that made his words sting differently. They no longer defined her entirely. They became accusations she could examine, instead of truths she had to accept. And this subtle shift unsettled Daniel. Though he could not name it, he sensed her distance, her quieter compliance, her eyes that no longer lit up with gratitude. And he responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control, under the guise of concern, checking expenses more often, questioning her more closely, reminding her of their agreement. And she found herself navigating a constant internal conflict between survival and self-respect, because speaking up risked consequences while staying silent eroded her further. And she began to experience a new kind of fear, not the fear of anger or violence, but the fear of never becoming herself again, of waking up years later still asking permission, still doubting her worth, still invisible. And that fear slowly grew louder than the fear of confrontation, and she started taking small secret steps that felt almost rebellious, like reading articles about financial independence late at night, using the library computer so it would not show up in their shared devices, listening to podcasts with one earbud, while doing chores, absorbing stories of other women who had lived through similar control and survived, and every story felt like a mirror and a promise and a warning, all at once because she realized she was not alone yet. She also realized how difficult escape could be, especially when abuse left no visible scars, and depended entirely on dependence itself, and guilt, and doubt, and she began saving tiny amounts of cash whenever she could change left over from groceries, a few dollars here and there, hidden in places Daniel would never look because he believed she was incapable of planning anything, and that underestimation became her quiet advantage, though the act of hiding money filled her with both hope and shame because she had been conditioned to believe that secrecy was betrayal, even though secrecy was now her only form of protection, and each hidden bill felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself, a whisper of autonomy in a life designed to strip it away. And as weeks passed, she felt stronger internally yet more careful outwardly, mastering the art of appearing compliant while growing inwardly resolute, and Daniel continued to blame her for her dependence, mocking her lack of ambition, questioning what she even did all day, dismissing her exhaustion, and sometimes he would compare her to other women who managed households effortlessly, who never complained, who trusted their husbands completely, and these comparisons cut deeply because they were meant to, because they reinforced the idea that her suffering was a personal failure rather than a systemic control, and still she endured because she was planning quietly, because she was learning that strength does not always roar, sometimes it whispers and waits and builds, and she began reconnecting subtly with old friends under harmless excuses, borrowing a phone, making brief calls, casual messages, nothing that would alarm him, but enough to remind herself that she still existed beyond his orbit, and those conversations filled her with both comfort and grief because they reminded her of the life she had lost and the woman she had been before. Fear became routine, and one evening after an argument about money, where he accused her of wasting resources, she finally spoke a sentence she had rehearsed in her mind for months, saying, "I need access to our finances. I need to understand what is happening," and the room went cold, not with anger but with disappointment, and he sighed deeply, as if burdened, as if she had failed some invisible test, and he told her she was being ungrateful, paranoid, influenced by others, and that hurt more than yelling because it framed her desire for agency as a flaw, and yet, she did not back down completely, she did not apologize fully, and that partial resistance marked another turning point, because she saw his control more clearly than ever in the way he dismissed her concerns, the way he reframed his dominance as generosity, and when she went to bed that night she cried silently, not because she felt defeated but because she finally understood the depth of what she had been living inside, and grief poured out for the years lost, the confidence eroded, the choices denied, and grief made space for anger, not explosive anger, but a steady burning resolve that told her she deserved more than survival, she deserved dignity, and this resolve began shaping her actions more boldly. She researched job opportunities, updated her resume slowly, cautiously, taking advantage of moments when he was away, and the process filled her with anxiety and excitement, intertwined because every application sent felt like stepping toward freedom and risking discovery, and she knew the path ahead would not be simple, that leaving would require resources, courage, and timing, that emotional abuse often escalates when control is threatened, and she prepared herself mentally for resistance, manipulation, and guilt, because she had learned his tactics too well, and yet despite the fear she felt something she had not felt in years, hope, fragile but persistent, and that hope became her anchor, reminding her why she was enduring the tension, why she was risking discomfort, why she was reclaiming her voice, piece by piece, and she understood now that financial abuse was not just about money, it was about power, about shaping reality, about making someone believe they cannot survive alone, and breaking that belief was the most dangerous and liberating act she could undertake, and though she still lived under his roof, still navigated his rules, still smiled in public, she was no longer the woman who believed she was weak, she was a woman in transition, gathering strength in the shadows, preparing for a future where her worth would no longer be measured by obedience or dependence, and that future, though uncertain, felt closer with every hidden dollar, every whispered plan, every quiet refusal to internalize his blame, and she knew that when the time came to step out fully, it would not be dramatic, it would be deliberate, because reclaiming yourself after control is not about escape alone, it is about rebuilding identity, trust, and courage from the ground up, and that journey had already begun, even if no one
else could see it yet.
By the time she reached what she quietly called part 3 of her life, the phase where awareness turned into preparation, she no longer felt confused about what was happening to her. But clarity brought its own kind of pain, because once you understand abuse, you start grieving everything it stole from you. And she grieved constantly in the shower, while cooking, while pretending to listen to Daniel talk about his stressful day. She grieved the woman who used to laugh freely, who never flinched before buying something simple, who never measured her worth against someone else's approval. And that grief made her tired in a way sleep could not fix. Yet it also sharpened her focus, because she understood now that staying required the same strength as leaving, but staying would slowly kill parts of her she could never get back. And that realization settled deep inside her like a decision waiting for the right moment to surface. Daniel, however, sensed the shift. Abusers often do when control begins to loosen, even subtly, and he responded by changing tactics, becoming softer in public, more generous with words, occasionally giving her small amounts of money and framing it as kindness, saying things like, "See how much I trust you, see how good I am to you." And this inconsistency confused her emotions, because hope can be a dangerous thing when you are trapped. It makes you doubt your own judgment. It makes you think maybe things are improving. Maybe you are being unfair. Maybe this is what marriage is. And there were moments she almost gave in to that thinking. Moments when she felt guilty for planning an exit, while he smiled and held her hand at family gatherings. But then the mask would slip again, usually in private, usually when money was involved, when he would remind her who really controlled their lives. And each slip strengthened her resolve instead of weakening it. Because patterns do not lie, and she had learned to trust patterns more than promises. She started imagining life beyond him in quiet, stolen moments, imagining waking up without fear, opening a bank account in her own name, earning her own money, making mistakes without punishment, and these imagined futures felt almost unreal, like a story she was reading about someone else, yet they gave her something to hold on to when the present felt unbearable. She also began to understand how deeply financial abuse is intertwined with identity, how being denied control over money had slowly convinced her she was incapable of handling life itself. And undoing that belief required more than escape, it required rebuilding confidence piece by piece, so she practiced small acts of independence wherever she could, making decisions without asking, trusting her instincts, reminding herself silently that she was not stupid, not careless, not weak, just constrained. And those internal affirmations mattered more than she expected, because emotional abuse lives in the mind long after physical circumstances change, and she knew that even when she left, Daniel's voice would echo in her head, questioning her choices, mocking her confidence, blaming her for struggles. So she began countering that voice now, while she still lived with him as a form of mental resistance. And there were days when the weight of secrecy exhausted her, when hiding money, hiding plans, hiding hope felt like carrying a double life. And on those days she felt tempted to give up, to choose the comfort of familiarity over the terror of the unknown. But then she would remember the grocery store moment, the shame, the helplessness, the realization that love should never require humiliation, and that memory grounded her again. She also learned that leaving was not just about her, it was about breaking a cycle that society often normalizes. The idea that a man controlling finances is leadership, that a woman depending financially is natural, that questioning these roles is selfish or disloyal. And she understood now how deeply those beliefs had trapped her, not just Daniel, but a culture that praises men like him, and doubts women like her. And this understanding gave her anger a direction, not explosive, not reckless, but purposeful. She began planning logistics carefully, researching shelters, legal options, financial counseling, knowing she might not need all of them, but knowledge itself was empowering. Every piece of information felt like a tool, a way out of the fog, and she took comfort in preparation, because preparation meant she was no longer waiting passively for change. She was creating it, even if slowly, even if quietly. Daniel continued to belittle her dependence whenever it suited him, accusing her of being lazy, unmotivated, useless. And while those words still hurt, they no longer defined her. Instead, they revealed his fear, because a man who is secure does not need to break someone else down to feel strong. And recognizing that shifted the power dynamic in her mind. She saw him now not as a provider or protector, but as someone deeply threatened by her independence. And that realization stripped his authority of its mystique, turning it into something fragile and defensive. And one night as she lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, she understood something that surprised her. She was no longer in love with him, not in the way she once had been. What remained was habit, fear, and a sense of obligation. But love requires respect, and respect cannot survive control. And accepting that truth hurt, because it meant mourning not just a marriage, but a dream, the dream of partnership, of shared growth, of safety. And she allowed herself to grieve that dream fully, because denial had kept her trapped for too long. And grief, though painful, was honest, and honesty was her new compass, guiding her toward a future where she would no longer have to ask permission to exist. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, she felt something steady beneath the fear, a belief that she could survive on her own, that weakness was not an inherent trait, but a condition imposed by control, and conditions can change. And that belief, fragile yet persistent, carried her forward, preparing her for the moment when planning would turn into action, when silence would turn into movement, and when the life she had imagined quietly would finally begin to take shape in the real world. By the time she reached the stage she privately thought of as readiness, her inner world had changed so much that staying began to feel heavier than leaving. And that shift mattered because fear had once kept her frozen, but now fear was simply another factor to manage, rather than a force that ruled her. And she understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move despite it. And she had been moving internally for months, building strength in ways no one around her could see. And Daniel still believed he had complete control, because control often blinds the one who holds it, and he mistook her calm for compliance, her silence for surrender, and that misjudgment became her advantage because it gave her the space to prepare without confrontation, and she used that space carefully, opening a small bank account in her own name with the help of a friend who never asked questions, saving enough to cover a few months of basic expenses and securing a part-time job that could grow to something more. And each practical step made the idea of leaving feel less like a fantasy and more like a plan. And planning grounded her because it replaced panic with purpose. And though doubt still visited her late at night, whispering, "What if you fail? What if he was right? What if you cannot manage on your own?" She learned to answer those doubts with evidence, not emotion, reminding herself of the skills she had already demonstrated, the resilience she had already shown, the intelligence required to survive under control without losing herself completely. And this self-validation felt awkward at first, because she was not used to trusting her own judgment, but repetition slowly rebuilt that trust, and she noticed changes in herself that felt both strange and empowering. She stood a little straighter, she hesitated less before making decisions, she no longer rushed to justify herself, and Daniel noticed these changes too, though he interpreted them as defiance rather than growth, and he responded with subtle punishments, withdrawing affection, increasing criticism, tightening financial scrutiny, and reminding her of how much she depended on him. And these tactics no longer worked the way they once had, because dependence was no longer absolute, and the threat of it had lost its power over her emotions, and she began to see his behavior clearly as fear masquerading as authority, and that clarity freed her from internalizing his words, even when they hurt. And one evening, during a conversation that seemed ordinary on the surface, he casually mentioned how difficult it would be for her to survive without him, how expensive life was, how dangerous the world could be for a woman alone, and she listened calmly, recognizing the message beneath his tone, and instead of shrinking, she felt a quiet anger rise, not sharp, not explosive, but steady, because she saw now how he weaponized fear to keep her close, and she realized that the danger he warned her about was not greater than the danger of staying invisible in her own life, and that realization hardened her resolve, and she began preparing emotionally for the aftermath of leaving, understanding that freedom does not arrive without consequences, that guilt, grief, and loneliness would likely follow, and she needed to be ready to face them without running back to familiarity. And so she built support intentionally, reconnecting with friends who reminded her who she was before control, rewriting her narrative in her own mind, not as a victim, but as a survivor, making a deliberate choice to reclaim her life. And this reframing mattered because it gave her agency, even in moments of vulnerability, and the day she chose to leave did not arrive with drama or confrontation. It arrived quietly on an ordinary morning, when Daniel left for work as usual, and she stood in the kitchen looking around at the life she had built under his rules, and felt no nostalgia, only clarity, and she packed what she needed slowly, deliberately, leaving behind objects that held no meaning, because freedom mattered more than possessions. And as she closed the door behind her, she felt fear surge, but also relief, because the decision had been made, and there was no turning back. And the first days after leaving were harder than she expected, not because she regretted her choice, but because independence is demanding when you have been conditioned to doubt yourself. And she struggled with basic decisions, questioning herself constantly, hearing his voice in her head criticizing her choices, and these moments scared her because they showed how deeply control had embedded itself in her psyche. And yet each challenge she faced, each bill she paid, each problem she solved weakened that voice and replaced it with her own. And she learned that strength is not a single moment of bravery, but a series of small actions repeated daily. And Daniel attempted to reassert control through messages alternating between guilt, anger, and promises of change. And she recognized the pattern, because she had studied it, because she had lived it, and that recognition protected her from being pulled back in. And she held firm, setting boundaries even when it hurt, even when loneliness pressed heavily against her chest, because she knew that returning would mean losing everything she had just begun to rebuild. And slowly life began to feel real again, not perfect, not easy, but honest, and hers. And she started to experience small joys that once felt impossible, like buying something without asking, planning a future without permission, and sleeping without tension. And these moments reminded her why she had left, why she had endured the fear, the uncertainty, the rebuilding. And she understood that financial abuse had stolen more than money, it had stolen time, confidence, and identity, and reclaiming those losses would take patience and compassion toward herself. And she committed to that process, knowing it would not be linear, that some days would feel heavy, that healing would not follow a straight path, and that was acceptable, because progress does not require perfection, only persistence. And as she settled into her new life, she also found a quiet sense of purpose in sharing her story, not publicly, not loudly, but honestly, with those who needed to hear it, because she knew how isolating this kind of abuse can be, how easily it is dismissed and misunderstood, and by speaking her truth, she reclaimed her voice fully and turned her pain into something meaningful. And though scars remained, they no longer defined her. They served as reminders of what she had survived and what she would never accept again, and she moved forward, not as someone who had been broken, but as someone who had been tested, and had chosen herself in the end. After the initial months of separation, the world began to slow down for her in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Life no longer felt like something happening to her, but something she was actively participating in. She woke up each morning tired but grounded, and that difference mattered. There was no one checking her spending, no one questioning her choices, no one framing her independence as a flaw. Yet freedom came with its own weight, because silence can be loud when you are no longer drowning it out with survival. And in that silence, old emotions surfaced: grief, anger, regret, and a deep sadness for the version of herself that had endured so much quietly. She learned that healing was not about pretending the past did not happen, but about allowing it to exist without letting it control the present. Some days she felt strong, capable, proud of how far she had come. Other days she felt fragile, overwhelmed by simple tasks, and ashamed that she still struggled after leaving. On those days she reminded herself that abuse does not end the moment you walk away. It lingers in habits, reactions, and self-doubt, and undoing it takes time. Daniel did not disappear easily. He continued reaching out, not constantly but strategically. Messages arrived during moments of vulnerability, late at night, on holidays, on days she posted something that suggested she was doing well. His tone shifted depending on what he thought would work. Sometimes he sounded remorseful, claiming he had changed, that he finally understood how much pressure he had put on her. Other times he was cold and accusatory, suggesting she had abandoned him, that she was selfish, ungrateful, unstable. She read these messages carefully, now not emotionally but analytically. She saw the manipulation, the attempts to regain control through guilt, through nostalgia, through fear. And although part of her still felt pulled by familiarity, she did not respond. Silence became her boundary, not because she was cruel, but because she understood that engagement was an opening, and she was no longer willing to give him access to her mind. As she settled into her new routine, she faced challenges she had never been allowed to face before. Managing finances was intimidating at first because it had been framed as something she was incapable of doing. Yet slowly she learned budgeting, saving, planning, and each success, no matter how small, rewired something inside her. Paying rent on time felt like a victory. Handling an unexpected expense without panic felt empowering. She realized that what Daniel had called weakness had never been real. It had been enforced through restriction and repeated doubt. Capability grows when given space, and she was finally giving herself that space. This understanding brought both relief and anger. Relief that she was not broken, anger that she had been made to believe she was. Relationships also began to look different to her. She noticed how cautious she was around kindness, how she analyzed tone, intent, and power dynamics instinctively. Trust did not come easily anymore, and she accepted that rather than judging herself for it. She learned that caution was not damage, it was wisdom earned through experience. Slowly she allowed herself to reconnect with people who respected her autonomy, who did not question her decisions, who listened without trying to fix or control. These relationships felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because they lacked the intensity she once mistook for love. Over time she came to appreciate their steadiness. She learned that healthy connections do not require shrinking yourself to fit. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A store aisle, a certain phrase, a financial form would trigger a familiar wave of shame or anxiety. In those moments she practiced grounding, reminding herself where she was, who she was, and that she was safe. She spoke to herself with the compassion she had never been shown. Instead of asking, "Why am I still like this?" she asked, "What do I need right now?" That shift changed everything. Healing stopped being a performance and became a process. One step forward, two steps back, still counted as movement. Eventually she began sharing her experience more openly, not for validation but for connection. She discovered how many women carried similar stories hidden behind successful marriages: polite smiles and quiet endurance, financial abuse, emotional control, invisible harm. It existed in places people rarely looked because it did not fit the stereotype of violence. Hearing others speak confirmed what she had learned. Abuse is not defined by volume or force. It is defined by the erosion of autonomy and dignity. And leaving is not failure. It is an act of self-preservation. As her life stabilized, she started imagining a future again, not just survival but possibility. Goals that once felt selfish now felt necessary. Growth no longer required permission. She was building something slowly, intentionally, and on her own terms. And while she knew scars would remain, she no longer saw them as signs of weakness. They were evidence of resilience, of learning, of choosing herself when it mattered most. She understood now that being financially independent was not just about money. It was about voice, choice, and the right to exist fully. And that was something she would never surrender again. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that was unfamiliar yet comforting. Because each day she woke up knowing that the decisions she made were hers alone, and that freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying, because she had been taught to fear independence and to doubt her instincts, and yet every choice reinforced a truth she had long forgotten: that she was capable, that she was intelligent, and that she could survive without anyone controlling her. And slowly she began to rebuild not just her finances, but her confidence piece by piece, learning to manage expenses, plan for emergencies, and trust her judgment. And each small success became a quiet affirmation that the woman Daniel had tried to diminish was still inside her, waiting to reclaim space in the world. And relationships began to shift as well, because she now approached them with discernment, recognizing who respected her autonomy, who valued her input, and who sought to dominate or manipulate. And she found that while some friendships rekindled easily, others ended quietly, and she allowed both because she understood that endings do not always signify failure but often growth. And one day she received an unexpected message from Daniel, apologizing formally and acknowledging his control and manipulation. And while part of her felt the old pull of familiarity, she did not respond, because she understood now that apologies could not erase years of erosion of trust and self-worth, and that healing required boundaries that were firm and uncompromising. And in the following weeks she continued to focus on herself, her work, her savings, and her emotional health, learning to sit with discomfort without shrinking away, to act decisively without guilt, to trust herself without seeking permission. And the small victories accumulated until they formed a foundation solid enough to support not just survival but thriving. And she realized that the lessons she had learned about power, control, and self-preservation extended far beyond her relationship and informed every aspect of her life, teaching her to negotiate fairly, to set limits, to assert needs, and to refuse manipulation without fear. And in this process she also discovered a passion for helping others in similar situations, quietly mentoring friends, sharing resources, and speaking openly about financial abuse when appropriate. And in doing so she turned her pain into purpose, creating a cycle of resilience and empowerment. And though there were days when the past haunted her, moments when she questioned her worth or doubted her abilities, she now had tools and strategies to navigate those moments, to remind herself that the scars were proof of endurance, not failure, and that each step forward was a triumph in itself. And as she looked back at the woman she had been when Daniel controlled every aspect of her life, she marveled at the transformation, not because it had been easy, but because it had been deliberate, because every choice, every action, every risk had led her to a place where she could finally breathe fully and stand confidently in her own power. And she understood that financial independence had never been just about money. It had always been about freedom, about reclaiming her voice, about trusting herself, and finally living a life where no one could diminish her worth again. And in that awareness she felt a quiet satisfaction, not arrogance, not triumphalism, but a deep-rooted certainty that she had survived, she had grown, and she had chosen herself, and that choice would carry her forward through whatever challenges life might bring, knowing now that she was whole enough to face them all with strength, dignity, and self-respect.